Alright, so I had a couple comments on one of my posts about one of my books, which is this one right here, asking if I should do a video on it. And a couple people actually said, yeah, so that's what we're going to do. So in order to actually do this and do it right, there's a lot of information in this book and some information online that you can find. So I had to do a lot of note taking. So right here I have like 7 pages of notes, so there's a lot to this. So it's going to be a 3-part video because to kind of understand the structure of the poem, or how the poems read, you should understand the structure of the poems and really when it started to happen, when they started writing these jisei, or death poems. So started about the Heian period, about 800. And there was during that time, a collection called the Man-yo-shu collection. And it was poems, a collection of poems. So that was the first time they were actually collected up, put in a book, is during this time period. So there's actually kind of 2 forms of poetry that they do. One's called tanka, I think I'm pronouncing it right, which is a short poem. Okay. In the way Japanese poems work, they're set up a lot different than Chinese poems, and we'll get to that. So a verse of 31 syllables in 5 lines, and the syllables are distributed in a pattern. So it would go 5, like a short poem would go 5, 7, 5, 7, 5. Okay, and I'll throw, as we go on, I'll throw examples up and stuff like that, so this doesn't sound confusing. And along with the long term, it consists of 5 and 7 syllables, but it's going to be longer. Okay, so it's a lot longer poem, but it still has a 5 and 7 in there in a pattern. So does it always have to land on 5? No. It could go 5, 7 and then end, or go 5, 7, 5, 7. It all depends on the poem, okay, and how many syllables are in it. So obviously Chinese poetry influenced Japanese poetry, just like their language and their characters. Okay, they just developed it to suit their culture. Now, unlike Chinese poetry, which rhymes, Japanese poetry doesn't rhyme. So that's another aspect where it kind of differs. So Chinese poetry, the number of words or characters are a fixed line for the most part in Chinese poetry. And there are kind of general principles that govern it to make it a poem. Okay, just like any writing category, there's general guidelines that you set by, whether you're writing a story or whatnot. So, like everything. And in Chinese poetry, they would have 5 characters per line, of 7 characters per line, or which are most common. I'm trying to read my notes too. Like I said, I have a lot of notes. So I'll try and find a Chinese poem, and I'll throw one up somewhere here or over here. And that way you can see the difference. Actually, I have one example right here. This example is from Li Po. And this is how it reads. Lost in wine, I did not notice dusk descending. Petals dropped and piled up on my robe. Drunk, I rise and walk the moonlit valley. The birds have gone, and the people too are few. So that's how a Chinese poem works, and it kind of rhymes. When you read it, it does kind of rhyme. So now we get into tanka and haiku. Haiku, we've all heard of haiku. Haiku has actually become really hit hard, not just in Japan, but once they open up the borders, it really influenced a lot of things, and we'll get into that one too. So, like I said, Japanese poems aren't rhymed, but they are written in a way, it kind of has alteration of the 5 and 7, like I was talking about, syllable lines. And it creates a rhythm, not a rhyme. So when they write, it makes a rhythm unique to Japanese poetry. So when you read like Japanese poetry, you're like, well, this doesn't rhyme, and what's it trying to say? So tankas produce a certain like dreamlike effect, presenting images of a reality. So when you read it, it's kind of like a dream, but it can create an image in your mind. Because they always have kind of like element of nature in their poetry. So when you read it, a certain image could pop in your head, or they might have an image with the poem. And that gets into, like I was saying, it provides a look into nature, but it regards the observer of the nature as well. So you have two aspects. You have nature, and then you have the observer of it going on in the poem, in a tanka poem. And you still have the pattern of 5, 7, 5 going on, of the syllable lines. Now, haiku is a form of a tanka, but it's compacted. Okay, the poem's compacted down. So there's less lines to it. So if we deconstruct a tanka into a haiku, there's one from Kino Surekui. He was from 870 to 945. He was a poet, a nobleman, and a scholar. And his poem reads, winds passing through this shaded grove, weigh down my robe with the scent of blossoms. There's a little bit of a rhyming there, but it's more rhythm when you read it. So it draws down on nature a lot, but you also have that element of the observer in it. So the location of the speaker is the shaded groves. Okay. And then how he recognizes the scents on his robe. So if we take this and we kind of change it around into a haiku, it'd be more like this. My robe grows heavy with the scent of blossoms. So you kind of have taken out the observer a bit and just focused on the nature part. Yeah, if that makes sense. So haikus a lot of times don't rhyme at all, okay? But they do have a fixed number of syllables, which you can sometimes violate that rule and change it up. So they got really prevalent, haikus, during this time period when they created it, because they felt they needed something a little bit different. They could be more than one sentence, but it always invokes only one poetic image. So like tankas, it can create different, like I said, create an image in your head, but it can create different types of images in your head as you're reading it, because it's a longer, say they're a short or long poem. Haikus are always short, so it's only going to generate like one image in your head, or they might have sometimes, a lot of times with haikus, they do have an image of nature above the haiku, or the haiku is printed on it. So during the 16th century, the conventions were kind of like universal and accepted, and there's like three of them. One is the haiku describes a single state or an event. Number two would be the time of the haiku is the present, so it's the now. Okay, it's never like in the past or in the future, it's right now. The haiku refers to images connected to one of the four seasons. So you'll have, either spring, summer, fall, or winter. Okay, so these are the set parameters that it focuses on, the three, for a haiku. So haiku is a little bit more kind of like in depth. And like I said, it's a set pattern. It can have 4 lines. It can have 2 lines. It all depends. It can even have 1 line. They're very, very short poems. And I'll throw up an example of how this works right here. And then I'll read you the alternate translation, because it looks kind of weird when you see it. My storehouse burned down. Now nothing stands between me and the moon above. So that little image I threw up and everybody kind of scratched their head on and went, this doesn't make any sense. That's the translation for it, because I did add the Japanese language, how many syllables, and then English language, because the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you see, those are marking the syllables. Okay, so you have 5 on one row, you have 7 on the next, and then 5 on the next. Okay. So there's been, some things that have been said about haikus. Like, it blurs the distinction between subject and object, self and other. But like I said, it's taking out the observer, and it's just focusing primarily on the nature part. So a lot of people speculate, I guess, that you shouldn't be doing that, or it doesn't make sense that you do that, because you don't know what's going on a lot of times. But the one I just read you get the point. Their building burnt down, but now they can see the moon. So it's basically like saying, yeah, I lost everything, but at least I still have, I can see the sky better at night. So there's a positive in it instead of just a negative. So how has haiku been kind of prolific around the world? is actually, it's a simplicity. So this simplicity has been sought for in philosophy, religion, literature, art, even movies. Because when you break down, when you really read haikus, they are very kind of like simple, and they are actually a really simple form. So if you know your syllables, anybody can write a haiku. They're not very difficult. Or you can actually take a poem, a pre-existing poem, and you can break that poem down and turn it into a haiku. So you're just taking one specific element. Like I said, with haikus, it's based on nature alone, whereas tankas is nature and the observer. So you're taking one of those elements out and you're keeping the most important element and making a haiku out of that. Like I said, that one example, the person who lost their store, you know, it went from a negative in the beginning to a positive at the end. The positive was being able to see nature. So this book right here, Japanese Death Poems, has so much in it. Because the majority of this book, and I will show you, I've just started touching on death poems and how they derive. And it's a long chapter, but that's all poem right there. So it's in two parts, the poems. You have the haiku poems, and then you have the tanka poems, which are from monks. Another aspect of how this derives is from Zen Buddhism. That's why a lot of monks will write them. But it wasn't just monks and noble people who wrote poems. General people during that time, too, during the Hanya period in 800, started writing poems. Now, the Mano Yoshi, if I'm pronouncing that correct, the collection of works I talked about, they also collected works from normal people, average people, too, which back then you didn't hear that. It was normally from poets and noblemen, maybe, you know, lords and the emperor. But no, they actually collected just average people's poems, and they put them all in a book together with this. So that was the first time ever that was ever done. And then as it caught on more and more, of course, they had scholars who became poets, you know, and that was their deal. Even the emperor's wife wrote some tankas or haikus throughout the centuries. So, and whereas Zen Buddhism comes from Chud, if I'm pronouncing that right, Chud Buddhism. So this is how the Japanese got their Zen Buddhism. It's from Chud Buddhism, because it's a much simpler form of Buddhism that was a little bit easier to grasp. So they kind of developed, they're not the ones specifically who's developed Zen Buddhism, but they adopted that. So it stems too from that too, Zen Buddhism in their culture, because it did exist in the Hanya period. And it kind of like helped open the door to a lot of things for them to study and expand on. And the influence from China, you know, the poetry from China. Because China, like I said, had its own set rules for poetry, and the Japanese just changed it. Just like some Japanese kanji will look similar to Chinese, and they'll be exactly the same, meaning the exact same thing too, in fact. But then there's variations to each one. So they adopted it. They didn't per se. They acknowledged the rules, how Chinese poetry went, but they also developed their own. So, like Chinese poetry will rhyme, whereas Japanese is more rhythm, if that makes sense. And hopefully all this made sense. Like I said, I tried to condense this down a little bit because there is like so much more to it, and I felt for people to kind of understand why they write death poems, it's best to learn their form of poetry and how they write it. The second part of this video will be getting more into death poems themselves, so I might be a little bit more in depth. The third video for this will be just poems of themselves. I'll choose from this book haikus and poems, and I will put them up there to some nice music, and you guys can read them. And really, these are just, there are too, they're poems from different people throughout the centuries. They have the dates. I'll try and make sure I have the name of the poet, the dates of their lives, and everything in here. Don't know when I'm going to get to doing the second video, because like I said, I just started getting into the history of the death poem. One aspect I can tell you right now why they do a death poem is because Japanese culture is also based on politeness. So it's like writing a will. Before their last days, they will write a death poem. It's like, not really a goodbye letter, but it's a reflection of their life. So we'll get into more of that in the second part of this video. But I hope everybody understood. I hope I didn't go too fast with this. It's probably a lot to take in. And let me know in the comments what you think. And we'll see you in this next one.